Good evening. I am sorry. I can't speak Ukrainian, so I'm not going to try it. But I can understand you, so feel free to speak Ukrainian. If there are any difficulties, I can translate to my colleagues. But first, let me express my gratitude to Irina for inviting us to this round table. I didn't expect everything to be so serious, to see so many people in front of me. I should warn you, I'm not a museum person. Out of everyone at this table, I'm the only one who doesn't work at any museum. So maybe it would be easier for me to moderate this discussion because I can look at it from the side. Let me now introduce my colleagues. Yehor Vradiy from the city of Dnipro. He is head of the research department called Museum of Jewish Memory and Holocaust in Ukraine in the city of Dnipro. Our next speaker is Professor Dariusz Stola from the POLIN Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw. This is a museum that does not require any presentation. To the right from me is Grigoriy Kazovskiy from the Museum of Jewish History in Russia in Moscow, and a consultant of the Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center. And the last but not the least, Dr. Yuri Gershovich. He's also a research consultant at Jewish and Tolerance Center in Moscow. Now, this is our joint forces, and we agreed on two questions that I will ask. Then everyone will have 3 minutes to give their answers. Do we want to have a discussion after each question or after both of them? So after this short organized round of questions, we will open the discussion and pass the floor to you. I can already see a few guests in here who have something to say about it. In the Russian tradition, it's called a piano in the bushes, so they are prepared to start. So my two questions. Question number one, I will try to be clear about what I want to ask. I hope you will understand me. The region that we are talking about, Central and Eastern Europe, whatever borders it might have, every time we speak about representing historical memory and how it is represented in a public space, in a museum in a particular, there is a dominating tendency, one mono-narrative. Narrative, is that the word you are okay with? Thank God. We can talk about an emotional national narrative or non-nationalist, but it's very monopolized and it sets the borders for the discursive character of our memory. What is legitimate, what is not legitimate, what is taboo, what is not, what is correct, what is wrong. And do you understand from Renan that the ability to forget is one of the key characteristics of this group nationalist mechanism, together with the ability to remember. That's why it's one monopoly narrative. It's very important, and it works every time in our region, in your region. On the other hand, in the past years, we have seen a boom of Jewish museums. We have representatives of 4 museums. Each of them were set up in the past 5 to 4 years. 4 or 5? Okay. In the past 7 years. It's very important. It's an important correction. So 4 institutions, and there are other institutes and museums and centers which have been set up in the past decade. This is my question. How is the creation and adding of new institutes to this space impact this very strict, monopolized narrative that I started with. How is this narrative being changed or not? Is it softened or not? Are there any new voices added by these new Jewish institutions to the discourse space? And how is it happening? And the word goes to Professor Stola.
I will speak English, those of you who need headphones. I apologize, but the topic is quite complex and I express myself much better in this complex medicine. So I'm not sure I agree with Semion, especially about this monopolistic vision. Second, I think that the timing, maybe appearance of simultaneous appearance of Jewish museums and a kind of exclusivist tendency. Because it takes many years to make a museum. So decisions to make a museum happen many years before you open the museum. And this coincidence in timing may be just a coincidence. That means many years ago some people made decisions to make the museums and they happened to be open at the time when atmosphere started to change. So this is a possible explanation. In Polish case, it took 21 years between the original idea to make a Museum of History of Polish Jews in Warsaw and the opening of the core exhibition, which was 2 years and 9 months ago. We still count in months, not in years. It took 21 years, so it was a very long process. And in this long process, many things have happened, but the things that happened, especially in the first decade, were much more conducive to the opening of this museum. And what did happen? So the idea emerged in 1993 at the opening of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, in the United States, where a group of my colleagues were invited to this opening, and they came back to Warsaw with a very strong conviction: we need such a museum. But by such a museum, they didn't mean a Holocaust museum, but a narrative museum. The Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. was the first big narrative museum, and they were very much impressed by this new type of the museum. But they very emphatically stressed they didn't want to have a Holocaust museum. And this is exactly what 20 years later happened. We have a narrative museum which covers 1,000 years of history of Jews in Poland, basically. Of course, we have a Holocaust gallery, but this is not the first one, it's not the last one. Speaking about this peculiar narrative, I think that what our museum does, it actually has an important nationalist component. But it is nationalist not in East European understanding of the term national. It's not ethno-nationalist. Actually, it's a national history from a perspective of an ethnic minority. Because to understand the history of Polish Jews, we must present the general history of Poland. For example, in the medieval gallery, you have the introduction of Christendom, Western Christianity from the Roman Catholic Church. Why do you show the Christian history in the Jewish Museum? Because it was a crucial factor shaping the history of Jews in Poland. For pagan Poles, before the introduction of Christianity, Jews were just a group of foreigners coming, one of the many. Later on, they were the people who are in the Bible, and that makes a lot of difference. So it's a selling point. When we advertise our museum to Polish teachers, we say, this is the best museum of history of Poland too. But not from an ethno-nationalist Polish perspective. And I think this is a novelty. Because you have many national museums all around Europe. But to my knowledge, no one has been made from a perspective of a non-dominant ethnic group. So I think this is our contribution to the understanding of nationalism institute. It's national because we believe, yes, there was such a country like Poland, which was different at different stages, and we believe Jews made part of it. So here we differ from the ordinary ethno-nationalists.
Thank you. Let me now invite Dr. Gershovich. Thank you, everyone. I would like to look at this from a different perspective, because what I think, every time we talk about a boom in Jewish museums, we need to look at each case separately, because they seem to be similar, but they are not really. That's why the phenomenon of having numerous Jewish museums in Eastern Europe is not a homogeneous phenomenon, and it should be looked at individual, because I represent Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center in Moscow, and despite being very similar to the museum in Warsaw, it is indeed, they have different tasks and objectives and different approaches to solving them, even though on the surface it looks the same. Now, my answer to your question, and the question I understood you asked was, can we create a certain multicultural narrative inside the museum? If I decide to open a museum in Ukraine, can I represent Jewish culture, Ukrainian culture, at the same time other nationalities that live in the country, so that each of the narratives is individual and full-fledged, so we have an entire mosaics reflecting a coexistence of these ethnic groups on the territory of, let's say, Ukraine or Russia. I know in Poland the situation is different. When we talk about the multinational, multicultural country, it's one thing. If we talk about a country with a more homogeneous population, it would be a different case. Or a different situation when we have a lot of different museums. There is a Jewish History Museum, there is a Ukrainian History Museum, Armenian History Museum, Georgian History Museum, and so on. And each of them impact the situation, the cultural situation in the country, and affect the narrative. Of course, the first one seems to be more adequate and better, I would say. However, I believe there will be time this will be possible, but as of today, it doesn't seem very realistic for one simple reason. Because understanding of your own narrative does not exist. If you look at it closely, it does not exist for Jews, for Ukrainians, for Russians, for anyone else. And the birth of these museums, as strange as it may seem, is a symptom of a newborn reflection on who we are and our attempts to build this narrative. This narrative is built under certain conditions. These conditions transform and deform this narrative. However, we also see the rise of different colors, of different identities, which could be noticed in different Jewish museums. I hope I managed to convey my idea. Is this time to end? Well, I'm just showing you that it's time to stop. Thank you. Yehor, you're welcome. Speaking of what a museum can be in Eastern Europe, I will be using our experience in our museum. When we were starting it in Dnipro, our main idea was for it to be a Holocaust museum in Ukraine and in Europe. Much later, we understood, when we started working on this concept, we realized it's impossible to talk about Holocaust without a wider context of what was before, what was after, and what civilization was lost. And out of this came our idea that our museum represents now, how that reflecting history is a question of context. We are trying, and this is also one of the ways to represent Jewish history or the history of Jews in Eastern Europe, is to give it through a number of contexts: regional, Ukrainian, European, world context. Why? simply because most of the people who come to our museum, they are not Jews. They are interested in Jews. They know that Jews exist, but they know very little about them. So what they want to know about Jews is to know something in the context of the events which are important for them personally. That's why we are talking, giving the context of important events in the Ukrainian history and the development and life of Jews at the background of these events and what these events meant for them. Now, when we speak on how it's possible to show it, when we just started the museum, our idea was to have it as a narrative museum, a museum of ideas, to depart from this traditional model that we used to have before. And a third thing, which was very important for us, which could be raised a little later, I hope, our museum was set up in the city, which is not a capital city. It's not a cultural center. And up till 1971, it was closed for any foreigners. That's true. So we had some more things that we managed to use in our museum. Thank you. Before I give the floor to our last speaker in this round, let me summarize it a little bit. A Jewish museum, it's not really Jewish museum. It's either Polish or Ukrainian, or the museum which reviews a narrative. It's on. It's very difficult to speak last because everyone said what I wanted to say. Let me just talk about a few details. Number one, it turns out that the Jewish museums are in high demand, and people are curious about them. They raise interest. In Moscow, for example, there are 3 Jewish museums. 2 of them are very prominent on the cultural map of Moscow and are being visited very often. However, the paradox is that everyone expects a Jew to be a Jew. However, when a Jew says he wants to be a Jew, he is denied this possibility. I can give you an example from my practice. I was working on an exhibition in the Tolerance Center, which was called Contemporaries of the Future, Jewish Artists in the Russian Avant-Garde. And it just happened that everyone, almost everyone, if not everyone, artist of the second Russian avant-garde, we had a lot in the first wave, so almost all the artists were Jews. When we prepared this exhibition, we tried to analyze this phenomenon and ask ourselves, why did this happen? After that, we were accused of nationalism. Why? Here is the fact. Nobody could deny that Kabakov, Yankelevsky, Pivovarov, Altman, Chagall, they were Jews. However, when it was a Jewish museum who decided to show them, it was a research. It was literally a research, because we asked ourselves why there is this mechanism of pushing out the Jews. It was unofficial art because it was a special environment. I am ending it. I still have a minute to go. So we were accused of nationalism. They said that we were guided by a national principle when choosing the artist. However, it was only possible to do it by the national principle, no other. So this question was raised, even though It demonstrated the importance of Jewish topic in the Russian culture, in particular in the Russian art. And I think that this interest and the task to stimulate this interest, to look for answers to these questions, is exactly what is the result, or could be a result, of Jewish museums. Thank you. We are done with the first round. We are now moving on to our second question. I will try to speak long but clear. We are talking about a Jewish museum as a new phenomenon on the cultural landscape. It doesn't matter how many years ago the idea came, how many years it took to create it, how this museum positions itself on the narrative line. Here is the question: what Jews are we talking about? And there are at least three answers, which have been voiced already, or at least hinted at. We did have a little hint about that. It could be a local Jewish history. It's especially very important if we look at the examples of prominent and successful Jewish museums. Vienna Museum belongs to the municipality. Other museums, prominent and important, belong to a Jewish community, and they are private museums. And they have been initiated by the Jewish community. For example, the Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center in Moscow. I don't know about Dnipro, is it private or not? So here, in all these cases, a local Jewish history and identity is represented very strongly. People want to make a museum about the Jews who are themselves. A second idea is national, inclusion of Jews into a national narrative, and Dariusz was very clear about that. If there are Polish museums, we can make a museum of Polish Jews. If there are Russian Jews, it's a museum about the Russian Jews, or the museum of Ukrainian Jews. This museum doesn't exist, but we have to first answer the question: what Jews are we talking about? Polish, Russian, Ukrainian? Or is it the same person who just lives in different places at the same time? In Lviv, for example. And it's quite a legitimate point of view. And there is, of course, a third legitimate point of view. Is Jewish museum a museum which talks not about a local specific narrative and not about inclusion of a Jewish element into a national narrative, but talks about the immanent group which has existed for 1,000 years. It's a transnational perspective, in other words. So Jews are a group who are friendly and in contact with each other. They look a little bit the same, even though they are divided into subgroups. So can we talk about the museums in Moscow, Dnipro, or Warsaw without remembering Alsace, New York, and something else? So we have all these three perspectives: local, national, and transnational. How can they live together in a Jewish museum? I will be liberal and I will ask who wants to answer first. I don't want to. I don't see and I don't know any recipe. I don't know any one recipe. Different narratives, and quite legitimate narratives. Can they be represented in the same museum together? Well, I think it's very difficult to do it in practical terms. Or maybe it is possible. I haven't thought about it. Our museum Its full title is the Museum of History of History of Jews on the territory of former Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, and it talks about Jews from the partitions of Poland to Perestroika, and it represents Belarusian, Lithuanian, Polish, Volhynian, Bessarabian Jews, Buhara Jews, Georgian, Karaims and Krimchaks, and even Gers from Voronezh and Tambo. These were peasants who converted into Judaism. We have even that in our museum, and at the same time we are trying to build our own logic, and we are showing this phenomenon as something united together by their historical destiny, by political history, how correct it is. And of course there are a lot of challenges with that.
Well, I think you must show all the three dimensions, because otherwise you cannot understand the people we are talking about. With one strong objection: I don't believe in anything outside of time, except God. Okay, God is outside of time. Everything else is inside history. So there is no such thing as imminent Jew, universal something. No, it's always local. And this is my reservation comes out of the long debates, because many people were asking us, why don't you have an introduction to your exhibition explaining what does it mean to be a Jew? What is Judaism? Okay, but the answer is there is no such thing as Judaism outside of time. It was different in the 13th century and different in the 20th century. So of course we have to explain it, because we assume that most of the visitors are not Jewish and most of them are not. But we do it in every historical gallery. So it's different for the Middle Ages, different for the 19th century, and different for the 20th century. Second, every museum is a local museum. Even if we have substantial, large international audience, some 30% of our visitors are foreign, and it's growing. Now in summertime, more than 50% of the visitors are foreign. We still believe this is a local museum. What does it mean? For example, a major part of the Holocaust gallery is about the Warsaw Ghetto, and it distorts the general picture of the history of Polish Jews under the German and Soviet occupation during the Second World War. Because we focus so much on the Warsaw Ghetto. Why? Because the museum stands in the middle of the former Warsaw Ghetto. Third, the question is, who pays? It's important who pays. In our case, we are a very peculiar institution, because we are a public-private partnership between the city of Warsaw, so you have the local government, the Ministry of Culture, so you have the national government, and a private association which represents a combination of historians and the Jewish community of Warsaw. And behind the association, you have a group of international donors, mostly Polish Jews in America, but not only. So you have a very complex group of supporters, and they have their own perspectives. By definition, the mayor of Warsaw has a local perspective of the city of Warsaw. And if she pays to have a female president of Warsaw, I understand if she gives me several million zloty annually, she would like to have something on the Jews of Warsaw. And it's understandable. The Minister of Culture would like to have a broader perspective. International donors would like to stress something else, and we should respond, but within certain limits, not distorting the knowledge of the past, the best knowledge that we have. So this is the red line. If anyone wants us to distort the history, to strengthen any particular interest, we must say no. And so far, we did it. And finally, speaking about the universal, you cannot understand any Jewish community without saying that it's a part of a wider diaspora, that there was a circulation of letters, of rabbinical responsa, circulation of people, marriages across borders of kingdoms, but within the Jewish community. Let's say the Hasidim of today's Western Ukraine, former Eastern Poland, had family relations across the border with Hungary. So you cannot have a good Jewish museum in Eastern Europe which is only restricted to national borders.
It's very difficult. I will try to explain it. For us, it's very difficult to understand who Ukrainian Jews are and what it means to be a Jew in Ukraine. And we talk about that, what it means to be a Jew. But in our museum, we want to talk about Jews who lived on the territory of Ukraine. And the territory of Ukraine could be different because the borders were changing. Did we have any Ukraine in the 16th and 17th century? However, when people come to our museum, these people understand that this territory is contemporary Ukraine, and they think of these people as Ukrainian Jews. When we speak about Jews on the Ukrainian territories, we also talk about Jews outside of the Ukrainian territories, because we need to tell where did they come from, how did their civilization take shape. We are a private museum, and we belong to one of the strongest and most powerful Jewish communities in Ukraine. And this community, by restoring its identity, also tries to show what it means to be a Jew in this place and in this city, Katerinoslav, Dnipropetrovsk, Dnipro. And this cultural context is represented very strongly in our museum. And I should add that this context, especially after the events of 2014, I assume it will go on. Because to be a Jew in Ukraine, to be a Jew in Dnipro, is a question which our visitors always ask. What does it mean? Is a Jew in Dnipro different from a Jew in Odessa or Lviv or even outside Ukraine? I can't really formulate the answer on how can we fit into this box or go outside it, and the only way is just to go to and forth. I think the question, it's not rather a question to give an answer to, but it's a problem which we cannot decide now. Everything depends on the concept and ideology behind the museum. One of them will be showing something like a regional context. The other one will be showing something different and show something transatlantic. When listening to the responses of other speakers, I was thinking, how can I describe my family? Let me describe it. My grandfather was born in Yalta in a very religious family. They lived behind a settlement line because somebody was serving in the army and they had a special permission. They had many children. It was a religious family. My grandmother her last name was Dobshin. She was somewhere from Austria or Czech Republic. And her father was invited to work at the railway. I don't know if it's a legend or not. The Tsar used to invite Jews personally to Bohemia, and he would invite them to work. During the First World War, my grandmother's family lived in Odessa in a large house with a governess. She was learning Latin and Greek language. In the war, all the men were killed and the women were left, and she married my grandfather. She wouldn't do it if it hadn't been for the First World War. My grandfather became a communist, and he called his children Dolore, and my mother is called Vilia for Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. My cousin married Muhammad ben Hamza at some point in the 1960s after a music festival, and she gave birth to 4 children, Misha, Kasim, Timur, and Marisha. They now live in France. They wear the six-ended stars. I'm not talking about all the Jewish people. I'm trying to think, how can we talk about these Jews? They grew up in Moscow. They speak Russian. They can cite Pushkin. Kasim was a student of mathematical department. So, I mean, you can talk about the Russian culture with them, but at the same time, they don't look Russian at all, and they live in France. Misha stayed with his father as a firstborn at the Lukamor Islands, and he is practicing Islam. Everyone else is victims of Islam. However, if we try to think what museum they could be in Vienna there was a museum like that. But there is a museum like that. I was trying to think of what model would fit them. At this humorous point, I would like to end this organized round. And now we have 30 to 40 minutes for a discussion. You can speak your mind, you can ask questions to our speakers, you can give your remarks, but please be short. And please name yourself when you start speaking. Stepan Davemuka. Back in the 1990, I was heading the executive council here in Lviv region, and the first Jewish society was created under our auspices when the Ruch was very active. It was back then that we came up with an idea to create a Jewish museum. We don't have a problem of a concept. Why? Simply because Jews in Galicia best fits what they had in Poland in its concept. The Jews in Galicia made up to more than 20% of the population. It was a very active national life with their schools, with their livelihoods, economy, lifestyle, art, religion, and so on. And if we take the borders of the former Soviet Union, that the museums from Moscow are trying to incorporate, there has been no other beside Lviv, no other city which would have so many Jewish monuments. In Lviv, you mean? Yes, in Lviv. That's why the concept we have is very clear. We need to show the past life of Jews who lived here in the past and died in a great catastrophe. It should be a museum that talks about the past and ends in a catastrophe. And this catastrophe should only strengthen the feeling of the large scale of this life of Jews here in Galicia. We used to have a museum in the interwar period. It was based on the collection of a prominent collectioner, Goldin, and the items are now in different museums of Lviv, in the Historical Museum, in the Museum of Religion, in Ethnographic Museum, in our Stefanik Library, and so on. So all these things are still here. Now the question is not about the creation of the museum, but rather on where the museum should be located. The question is about a building. and we have a lot of wealth from the Jews. We have had a lot of research, a lot of dissertations, and we know about it, and we can do it. The only thing we need is to be initiative, and there is a working group which has started working on it. The community needs to be united and to pressure the authorities so that the final part of it, the final problem could be solved. We have the experts, we have everything to create the museum. Thank you. We understand what you are trying to say, but please be brief. That's why these offers and proposals that are coming from Moscow to us, for us Lvivites, they are not very spicy. But let me give you 2 books at the end. I wanted to give it to Dnipro Museum. We published this great book, Ivan Franko's Moses, and the first translation of Herzl's The Jewish State. Why? Because Franco met Herzl, and the death of Herzl in his life was the final period, the final punctuation mark which made him write his poem Moses. And the illustrations, wait a minute, you from Moscow, you don't know it. The illustrations are by a famous graphic artist, Lilian from Drohobych. I don't know if you know this fact. Can I maybe interfere? I present it to you. Unfortunately, I only have 2 copies. However, wait a minute. Don't take it away. Unfortunately, the Moscow people from Moscow, you may not be allowed to cross the border with it. Let me tell you that both Muscovites here are actually living in Israel. Maybe we could set a time limit for your questions of 1 minute. You need to raise your hand. So the first is from Irina.
Good evening, my name is Dariusz. I'm the director of the Foundation Babia Holocaust Memorial Center in Kiev. I know how to speak 1 minute. I was in European Parliament 10 years, and if we have 1 minute, it was a lot of time. I don't want to refer to the museum, but I would like to refer to something what is the process of building the new identity. We are representing the post-Soviet area in different places. And the area where the history was totally biased, was totally destroyed by the system, by the politics, by the doctrine, by the ideology. And I understand that the temptation to have true history is dominating, and is also the reason why we pay for the institution like the museum. Why the museum? Museum because we are living in the culture of pictures. It's easier to go to the museum than to read a book, and that's why these are so successful institutions. But definitely, without mentioning that we are building the history, or we are discovering we cannot explain why it is such a good mood for the institution which you represent. So this is the first. The second is that there is another temptation. There is a temptation to build the new biased history, because there's a huge temptation how the history can be useful for the politics now. And I'm going to the simple question. I know that you keep as far from politics as possible, which is not possible, of course. But my question is, do you feel this secret touch of the politics in this fantastic mission which you are performing every day?
Это вопрос Dariusza.
Все, для всех.
Окей.
I have several questions. And I want to stress on the importance of this discussion for us, because the discussion about Jewish museum is starting in Lviv. There were discussions going on the change of museums, and your experience, what you brought here, is very important. And I would like to talk about a few things here. It is very important that all of you talked about the shared narrative and about including a Jewish narrative into a dominating national narrative. But yet, it still seems that we are together but apart. When we are talking about institutions, and I'm interested in the example of Polish institutions, what do you think? We are together, but we are also apart, and we are dividing. In Warsaw, we have a museum of Polish Jews and Polish history. How do you work with this history? Do we need to divide it like that? My other question is to my colleagues from from Israel, who work in 2 Russian Jewish museums. These museums are very interesting, and they have 2 different approaches. One is narrative, the other one is object-based. Now we have this ongoing discussion on what museum should be. Why didn't you have the idea of uniting these 2 narratives? Because you have a wonderful collection and you have an opportunity to tell something through it and with it to tell your story. Why didn't you make 1 cool museum but 2 which are also very good? And my third question was provoked by our respected gentleman from Lviv. As a representative of institute who works with Jewish heritage and history, I might be a little bold, but I should say we don't have experts here in Lviv who are capable of making a good critical museum. That's why this is a question to some of you. What are the challenges that you had with the personnel when you started the museum? What was your experience? Because I'm looking to hear that it's very difficult to make a good museum without specialists. We've had a few questions already. Maybe we should try to give answers to some of them.
I can answer first the question about the politics, but I understand it's for all of us. I would say, with the present government that we have in Poland, which has a rather aggressive historical policy, especially my colleagues from the Museum of the Second World War in Gdańsk have experienced brutal pressure against them. I am surprisingly safe. No attempts to push me, to tell me what the museum should do. I was even advising my colleagues from Gdańsk that if they change the name of the museum from the Museum of the Second World War into the Museum of the Holocaust and the Second World War, that would save them a lot of trouble. There is a kind of sensitivity for the Jewish history, even among Polish nationalists. Well, maybe not the complete right-wing nationalists, but the nationalists that are running the country today. So it's surprisingly safe. Second, as a public-private partnership, I have the checks and balance mechanisms inside my museum. That means my other founding partner is the city of Warsaw, which is run by a very different party that is running the country. So I have a kind of balance in this way. Speaking about the inclusion and exclusion, I think this is exactly the point. That you can claim that we can live together being different. I think this is the essence of it. And most of the story that we show is that in old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the political elite, the nobility, developed a proper way of managing religious diversity, because at that time it was religious diversity, between the Roman Catholics, Orthodox, Greek Catholics, Protestants, Jews and Muslims, with of course Jews and Muslims being the subordinate, the pariahs of the system because they were not nobility. But they benefited from the general atmosphere of tolerance. It failed with modern nationalism. So I understand that Franco could love the Zionist idea, because these were the same East European nationalisms that led to the establishment of Israel, Poland today, Ukraine and other countries, but it didn't work well with the minorities. It's very clear. And these countries were very fragile. Okay, interwar Poland or Lithuania lasted only 20 years. And then came the big brother, okay, and they disappeared. So I think it's not only sentimentalist. I would say it's more than political, it's meta-political. It's about what kind of political community we can create in a very diverse contemporary societies, which are, let's say, more diverse in Ukraine or in Russia than in Poland, but it is diverse anyway. So I think it's a good answer, it's historically accurate, and it provides a solid basis for a future.
Yehor? Jeśli jest żelanie, to widzę.
The question was how we depend on different political questions and how we shape this policy. We are in a better position because we are a private museum and we don't depend on policy. However, we think of a museum not only as a place of comfortable history, like all contemporary museums would think of it as an educational center. And through the prism of our museum, we are trying to shape the politics. We have chosen a certain path to look for mediators, people who know about the past and the ideas we want to convey. And among these mediators are the history teachers. Every month we have a workshop for history teachers who are being recertified in different pedagogical institutes. We are trying to impact certain political decisions. And I want to show you a little achievement of ours. We all came out of a post-Soviet space, but when we talk about the impact of museums and Jewish institutions, I should mention that Ukraine was the first post-Soviet country to introduce the study of Holocaust into the educational program. And last year, a syllabus of the second elective course was introduced due to our efforts. This question, as a conclusion, we are trying to cooperate with all public and state institutions. However, our main intention is to be left alone. We don't want any help, but we don't want any interference. Oh, it's about the politics. On the one hand, I do agree with Dariusz, but I also don't, because the neutral policy is also politics. The bigger the museum and the bigger the city, the more we depend on the politics. It doesn't have to be political pressure. I have a simple example. If Putin gives away his salary to the museum, then you feel uncomfortable to do something which is it's not because of the pressure. I'm talking about the atmosphere. You can see that the atmosphere in Russia is changing very fast. And the question is whether this or the other institution can react or respond to this. And is this response right or not? It's impossible to do it now. It will be possible to do tomorrow. But the question is very controversial. We have just had a session where we discussed this museum, and there are a lot of challenges indeed, ethical, political, and other, that require a very lengthy discussion. But it's impossible to say that you can be independent from politics. It's impossible. Now your question that you asked about merging two beautiful museums into one. It's exactly because of certain political reasons and personal reasons it's impossible. Simply because the owner of the museum where Grisha is making his exhibition does not agree with the owner of my museum. They have their controversies, they have different views. It's very difficult to merge them. However, of course, when you look at it from the abstract perspective, that would be a good solution. However, will this happen or not? We don't know. The process is very difficult indeed, and there are many problems on that way. Now, speaking about the personnel and the staff, Semion was right to say that we are from Israel, and we were invited from Israel, and Grisha is from Israel. We were invited to head a museum. The Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center was created by 4 researchers. One of them is from Russia, 2 are from the United States, 1 from Israel. So it's mostly they are invited researchers. And how well do they know the Russian history? Of course, after the exhibition was open and we had Russian historians coming in, you understand what they say. Oh wow, these Americans, they don't know anything. No, they said a different thing. I softened it a lot. They use different words. That's why the question about the competence, it all depends on the ambitions of the museum, on the objectives it wants to pursue. For example, Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center was planned as the biggest museum in Europe. We wanted to be big, and for that we needed to invite big people and big designing company. It's one project. The other project, for example, the Museum of the Jewish History, it's a private initiative. It's a collection of objects. And by its objectives, these are impossible to combine. I have nothing to add. And then you talk for 40 minutes. I can only say that everyone lacks good experts and specialists. And that's why we work everywhere in all parts of the world. Let me also talk about the politics and personnel and how everything would be very easy in Lviv. Well, I should be banal and say that life is a complex thing. Life is a very complex thing. And the creation of a museum, no matter how noble an opportunity you see it, no matter how well you understand what should be in it, it's also a very complex thing. And let me tell you, any museum you create in Lviv, in Babi Yar, in Warsaw, in Russia, it will always be criticized. There will always be people who will use facts, who are scholars, and who will say this is not right, this is not how it was. Or you would say this ideology is very doubtful. How can you show the Lviv pogrom of 1941? Will you make it the 1918 pogrom? It was done by different people, and the Germans, they did something else. And then you will say, we will show it honestly. We will show all the illnesses, all the dark pages of our history. We will have school children come in and make conclusions. And then other people will say, and they will tell you, what are you showing here? We need a very clear narrative and message, and you are trying to dilute it by some non-understandable stories, by provoking sense of guilt. the museum in Warsaw, and they have a great director. Dariusz doesn't know. I think that about him. I used to organize it in the museum, and Dariusz had a wonderful presentation, and there were questions, quite provoking questions. We are living in Israel, and we don't like you calling us somebody who skipped from Poland, and you are making it a national narrative. We had a bad life there. It's very good that you are trying to show and solve some of your Polish problems, but we as Jews, we are not happy about this. And somebody was even hinting that maybe you are a wonderful researcher, but you are not a Jew. How will you talk about Jewish history to us? It's very complex. And about the book, I liked your example that instead of reading a book, people come to the museum. I have an anecdote for you. When President Yushchenko came to Israel a few years ago, he signed a decree on giving a title of a hero to Gershovich. And I had a call from a journalist. Somebody told me that you could comment on this, and I said I could comment on something, and he was very upset, and he said, well, Gershovich, did he kill Jews or not? And I was saying, well, I cannot really answer that. Can you tell me yes or not? And while I was thinking, he hung up. It's impossible to do it like in the book. It's impossible to do it, to simplify it as in the book, just exactly as in our life. We are not just angels or demons. It's the same in history. So why don't we make a museum where everything is like this? On the one hand, there was this. On the other hand, there was something else. And then people will ask you, are Jews good or not? So they were good at this place, but not very good here. So are they good or not? But it depends on how you look at it. But please tell us, what is your message? And you were very right. Here is the difference between a very complicated book of history or any narrative museum with an educational mission where people come and get an answer. And here I come back to what I said at the beginning. Your answer will be unacceptable to a great number of people.
Marcin Wojcicki from Wrocław. I will speak English. Sorry. I have two questions with which I would like to return to opening question and encourage the speakers to maybe to rephrase a bit. What Dariusz said about ownership issue, I think is critical, and I would expect all others to lay bare what is the relation between the full disclaimer, what is the ownership issue of your museums and how, or maybe not, it affects the meta-narratives of the stories that you say. And second, from another perspective, what Ira asked, what is the relation of your institutions to... Okay, we are speaking quite a lot about the museum and the visitors, but there's also another side. There is a side of those who provide to the museum. How you perceive your institutions as responsible for development of scholarship, and what is relation between those two in your institutions?
Марчин, спасибо. Второй вопрос я понял хорошо, а первый не понял. Если можно, я мои коллеги, что мне...
Okay, so I will explain in other words. There is ownership issue. Each of your institutions belong to somebody, and this somebody might have influence on what story you say. And we didn't hear who owns those museums in particular, and whether he or she or they, the body, whatever it is, demanded or encouraged certain narratives, or encouraged certain stories not to be presented, or to be presented in certain ways. Dariusz said about 3 bodies with very differing objectives, which resulted in certain resolutions. This is not all the story. I hope Dariusz to continue on this, how this was resolved finally, but this is obviously a critical issue for any museum, what the owner or the potential owner demands from the institution to convey. And we cannot say about abstract. In each of those institutions there is individual or a group or the body institution.
Can we get one or two questions and then answer them? Oh, of course. Sorry, I'm sorry. Volodymyr Hayu, former director of the Museum of Religion, and now deputy director of the Department of Religion and Relations. Our museum has long had a great exhibition of Jewish history. I am very surprised to hear we don't have specialists, because we have a plan of the museum, we have a program and the exhibits for this museum. If you want to know if we know the Jews, I was born in Kazovskiy, where the Hasidism was born, and the Hasids were friendly with us, and they were more numerous than Ukrainians and Poles. We had 4 football teams. Two of them were Jewish, 1 Ukrainian, and 1 Polish. Who was the champion? Well, I didn't play in that team. A friendship won. We had more Jews than there are now Jews in Israel. And the motherland of Jews is Galicia, and the fatherland is Israel. So all the Jews came from Galicia. When you check everyone, you will see that all of them have a family here. We have 2 big cemeteries in Kosiv, where I grew up. And if you want to see how we are making a museum, maybe you should go and see how we made a Catholic museum here in Lviv. Our specialists did that. Come see our museum. We have 400 Torahs and fragments of Torah saved by Ukrainians. It was being brought to the dump, and we managed to stop the vehicle and save these 400 Torahs. And we saved it because we struggled the same. We were oppressed people here on this territory, and we felt as brothers, and we helped each other. That's why it's our sacred duty to make a museum of Jews here in Lviv, and we are going to do it. We have the exhibits, we have the people. It was a very good joke, which you were saying that it's a small room. However, we have a translator in the other room, and she can't hear you. Jason Francisco, first participant of Jewish Days in Ratusha.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm an artist and a professor from the United States, and I've been to Jewish museums all over the world. I've also been to many places in Eastern Europe that formerly had large Jewish communities that now have no traces or very few traces of Jewish life. And my question has to do with what might be called the frontiers of the museum, the obligation or the desire of the museum to move outside of its walls and to bring its mission and its purposes across the countrysides of the countries in which these museums were built, to, in a sense, decentralize itself and to partner with local leaders and communities in order to bring awareness of Jewish history and of Jewish people back to the places where Jews once lived. I know that the POLIN Museum has an initiative called Museum on Wheels, in which it brings parts of its exhibition around Poland, and I think that's a wonderful initiative. But I'd be interested to hear all of your thoughts about your institution's relationship to to those peoples who are not easily able to visit.
And now the last question, before we give the last floor to our speakers. Okay. Very well. You're welcome. One more question, the last question. Before the war, there were a lot of buildings which belonged to the Jewish community. Why can't we use one of these buildings built for the Jewish money? Why can't we give it back to the museum? I have an answer for you. None of the people who sit here, they don't know it. I understand that. And now the last question. Lyudmila Levchenyuk. I just returned from Warsaw, from Lane Kirkland internship, and I was an intern in Polish I was also in the POLIN museum. My question is about the shared moments of the history. Jewish Ukrainian and Jewish Polish, because the POLIN museum's narrative has two things which apply to each Ukrainian and each Jew. Number one is killing of Jews during Bogdan Khmelnytsky, and second one is the pogroms in Lviv by the Ukrainian nationalists. My question is to Dariusz and to other. I'm sorry, I haven't been to Dnipro. I don't know what questions you raised there. Simply because it develops a complex of victim, which is so this complex of guilt and the feeling of trauma, as well as reconciliation between the people. Is there a continuation? Because the messages in POLIN are very clear. How do we work on these? How do you work on these topics in your? How can you answer that? Thank you. Now it's the last round. Dariusz, for you there were a lot of questions.
Beginning with the last one. First, you need to talk about it. If you have painful moments in the past, the worst thing is to avoid it. And the good one is to talk about it. Second, that our museum is only one step in the long history of Polish debates on Polish Jewish history. So it didn't start with the museum. Actually, the museum was quite late in the process. We had several debates, including the biggest debate on history in Poland ever, and that was the debate about the pogrom in Jedwabne in summer of 1941, parallel to the pogrom in Lviv, and we show both of them parallel. Pictures from Jedwabne and the film from the pogrom in Lviv. So third is reducing the commentary of the historian to the dry minimum, to the basic facts, and bringing the emotional aspect, for example, by the faces of the victims. So our presentation of the Jedwabne pogrom, you have faces of the Jewish inhabitants of the town of Jedwabne before the war, and very short information about what happened in July 1941. So it's very restrained, and I heard criticism that this is not enough. Of course it's not enough. But for a museum of 1,000 years of history, devoting some 4 square meters to a single day in a single small time is already a choice to show it. And I think now we not only have these long debates, and we have books of these debates, we have analysis of the debates. So there is a lot of intellectual work. And I think it's good, because we better understand ourselves in it. So my suggestion is start talking and try to watch what are the rules of the discussion. And these rules were conducive. I think we've made a lot of progress. We have developed a language, a kind of Polish language to talk about what Poles did to the Jews during the war, which did not exist in 1987. It was developed in the 1990s and the 2000s. Now the question of the ownership. I think it's crucial. Who is your owner? Who sets the rules? But then, even the owners of the museum, the City of Warsaw, the Ministry of Culture, and the Association of the Friends of the Jewish Historical Institute, they had to take into account the historians. Because without the historians, they cannot make a reliable museum. They can make a museum, of course. You can have a private museum or anything. But then, who will trust you? They need authority of historians. And here, the historiography of Polish Jewish history has been very well developed. Probably it's the best developed part of history of Poland today, at least for the 20th century. So it's not so easy that you own something, you give the money and you decide. It's much more complex. You cannot decide anything. Of course, you can buy any propaganda, but will it be reliable? Will people 10 years from now trust you? And I think we as historians, we don't have the money. But we have something like public authority. Maybe we will lose it in some time, but still we have it. I'm not going to tell all of the time, so I'll leave the rest for my colleagues, for them to respond.
Я почну з приводу болісних питань. Це те, за що нас найбільше критикують.
We'll start with the painful questions, especially because this is something we are criticized for. Because every time we try to illustrate controversial issues from different kinds of history, the pogroms of 41 or collaboration of local population with the Holocaust, or the tragedy of Jewish agricultural colonies during the Holodomor of 32 and 33. There are always several views on that. I have an example. When we talk about Holocaust, we often hear criticism which says that most of the Cheka members were Jews, and we know that. In our museum, we have a part of exhibition, Jews, victims, or punishers. And we show Jews who made their career in Soviet institutions, punitive institutions. At the same time, we show other Jews who were victims of that system. In the same way, we talk about the collaboration of local population and their participation in massive killings of Jews. We are talking about that and about the Lviv pogrom. At the same time, we are not making any generalizations. What we are trying to do is to show the variety of events. For example, the story of Fedor Volk in Nikopol, head of the own unit, who was saving a Jewish family in his house, and it destroys the metrics altogether. As to the impact of our owners on the policy, we opened the museum in 2012, and the biggest influence of the owners was at the time we developed a concept. It was the most difficult period. This influence was because people who developed the concept, they had to persuade why they want to see it in this or the other way. Because the founders of the museum, they had a certain image of what they wanted to see. They had the image based on the best museums that they have known at that time. And if we speak about the Holocaust, it would be Yad Vashem. We talk about the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and they knew how it should be. And at the same time, they would be saying how it should be and what people should feel after they come out from the museum. However, after a long discussion, we managed to convince them that it could be different and we could do something different. I cannot advise you, of course. I am very respectful to the Jewish history of Lviv and the Jewish past in Lviv. However, when we planned our Jewish museum in Dnipro, we didn't have any building. This big building, menorah, where all the Jewish institutions of the region are located now, it was a continuation of the museum. The museum was opened much earlier. And when I hear that we don't have a building and we can come up with the concept in 2 minutes, I think it's an oversimplification, because I think a detailed concept should come first, because a building is the easiest thing to be done in the future. Now about the information spread, how do we go out of our museum? Let me explain. We have a tragedy and we work with it. What is this tragedy? The foreigners and tourists are normally coming to a few cities in our country. To Kyiv, because it's the capital, to Odessa, because there is a sea and warmth and beautiful women. I'm talking about the foreigners here. And we have Lviv, because Lviv is multicultural, it's ancient, it's beautiful, it's authentic. A lot of people think that Lviv is the only European city in Ukraine. I mean, it's an image that has been created. And to bring people to Dnipro, or to make people come to Dnipro regularly, is much more difficult. That's why we have developed a concept of mobile exhibitions, and by means of these mobile exhibitions we are trying to communicate our ideas and show these parts of expositions which we could share. At the moment we have these mobile exhibitions. They do not represent the entire museum. I wanted to say about the owners of the museum and how they influence. I was just telling you this, but not everyone was at the session, so you will hear it for the second time. The museum, this Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center, has one peculiarity, and it's very important but not very noticeable. The peculiarity is that the museum was created by a religious community, which was not supposed to make a museum, because religious Jews do not need a museum. The museum was not created for the Jews. It was created to position this new community. This is a new community at all. These are new Jews. I've been living in Russia for 20 years and I haven't seen these Jews. They have their own community life. It's something which appeared due to the national Renaissance. And one of the tasks on the post-Soviet space is self-representation, saying that we are not bad. You can work with us. We have our history, and we've been living here for a long time. These ethnic groups, they are not from here. They have come from somewhere, from the mountains, for example. But what's important is the community wants to feel a full-fledged member of the Moscow community. There is also a Hasidist ideology of trying to praise God with everything you can, and if you do something wonderful, it could be a praise for God. So when I'm speculating here, I don't know how it was really. I don't know the real story. But I think they were in the least interested about what will be in the museum. They wanted to have the history of Jews in Russia. They were not interested in what, they were interested in how. They wanted it to be bright, beautiful, spectacular. I started to work in the museum after it was set up. It was set up as a beautiful toy, and it's exactly the function it operates, and people keep coming to it. After what the owners do after the museum was open, they insist on this objective. They want to get more people. Our temporary exhibitions have nothing to do with the Jewish culture. So it's not so much about us traveling, but other people coming to us. Anish Kapoor and the avant-garde exhibition, we even had the Chinese art. Why do we do it? To bring people in. We have different educational programs which have nothing to do with the Jewish culture. Of course, we have some about Jewish culture, but there are a lot which have nothing to do with it. And it's all with a single purpose of bringing people in. All the interference from the owners, from the community members, is insisting on making it more and more interactive, because they understand that the toys, they get old and we need to renew them all the time. However, I don't remember them interfering with the content, in my experience. I could also try to answer the question which does not relate to our museum about the sensitive spots. Maybe I'm wrong here, but I don't think any museum can create a narrative if this narrative is not accepted in the community. If there is a debate about some certain sensitive items, if some topics are very painful and they produce conflict, I don't think the museum could be a place saying that we need to realize, to reflect, and to assess a certain historical event. It's more of a media discourse, political discourse. Only after it gets clear, after this public discussion, the museum can start making an exhibition like that. I think that the creation of the museum in Warsaw was a culmination of this debate which was happening in the Polish society. And I think we can say just the same about the Western Europe or Germany. You could open a museum of Holocaust there. It was impossible to do it back in 1946. A few comments right now. Please allow me to speak Russian so our guests can understand me. Could you please present yourself? Adel Dianova, head of the Jewish community and leader of Hesed Charity Fund, the city of Lviv. I was scared by one thing. I was scared by a phrase which was pronounced by two people, by you, Semion, and by you, Yuri. You said that we are showing that we are either good or bad in the museum. I also sensed it in the Dnipro museum. I felt this. Why should a museum, no matter what is a Jewish or Ukrainian or Tatar, why should we be showing that we are good or bad? Why should we talk about it at all when we speak about the Jewish museum? When we talk about a Jewish museum, about the history of Jews on a certain territory, why should we be simplifying it to good or bad? They are regular people like everyone else. There are villains and heroes among them, just as among the Ukrainians or other nations. I don't like this approach. You had a pogrom that you participated in, but you were Cheka members and KVD members. This is something I don't like. If you have this in your museum, I don't approve it, because you should just as well say that the NKVD included Jews and Ukrainians, because there were Ukrainians there. If you want to say that it was only the Jews who were the NKVD members, it's not right. Sorry, I lost my thought. But I think this is my main point. Yes, I can, of course. Our museum does not have any problem. No, we do have a lot of problems. However, there are no problems with the sensitive points you mentioned. At least in our museum's narrative. These are the points about which we have consensus in the Russian discourse. This is pogroms of 1905-1906. These are pogroms during the Civil War, the Baylis case, and anti-Semitic campaigns initiated by Stalin, the doctor's case, destruction of Jewish culture. But I do agree, I have been saying this before, I do agree with Dariusz. These are only episodes in Jewish history which should be presented in a right way and not as part of a general story. In addition to that, in our museum, we have consciously changed this martyrological line. We do not stress on it. Now about the owner. We are more interested in other sides of Jewish life. About the owner, our museum is private, and its founder and owner is Sergei Ustinov. He is a Moscow businessman. His real name is Goldin, by the way. And with all his advantages, he has a lot of influence on the museum. He made up the name. He demanded this type of approach. He demanded that we represent all stages of history and culture. However, he also relies on the research, on our scientific experience, and he can solve financial questions very easily. Yehor, but briefly. When I answer the question about these sensitive points, I cannot give you the visual characteristic of our exposition. You should come and see how it's represented. We don't show the punitive Soviet institutions as a Jewish only thing. We don't show it by a national principle. Your question about showing Jews good or bad, or only good or bad, we are trying to show the entire picture. We need to talk about history. We are showing history. Maybe I am hyperbolizing it. I would like to put an end to this discussion and to apologize for the last time about what we have heard here. There is a term, ownership of the past. It is used to talk about different debates on historical memory. It's often used about the experience of Germany, what they should do with their Nazi past. They need to own their past. When a society, the society cannot live without a narrative or history, without understanding that we came from somewhere and we are going somewhere and we have a certain baggage. However, this baggage is changing, and we can say very easily in post-socialist countries we are looking for a new narrative. Poland has found it, Ukraine is still looking for it, but it's changing everywhere. Look at the United States, how they are changing their approaches to the museums of Native Americans, and because this is a result of a certain new consensus and new debates, and this is a tribute we need to pay. It's not only in the newly born narratives or societies. These debates are going on everywhere, in France and Spain and everywhere. I don't agree with Uri in one thing. I think the consensus which comes before the creation of the museum is the result of two processes, either the debate or the taboo. So there are a few big things which we don't raise when we are saying this is history, this is how it works. I don't know what history is. I made a career out of it and I don't know what it is. So we don't touch these things. We are moving forward. We are creating something. We can discuss this product we produce. But we do have a certain consensus based on what we create, for example, a Warsaw museum, but we need to renew and rethink it all the time. There will be people who will come and say, what you're showing is not right and you need to redo it. And I think this is the